relations with Iran and the Europeans' reactions?
It's an excellent question, and it is a very timely question because President Trump has made it very clear that he intends to decertify Iran. He has an obligation to send a certification every 90 days to Congress to say whether Iran is in compliance or not. That assessment is largely built on the assessment of the U.S. intelligence services, which so far have said that Iran is complying, as well as the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, who now have issued 8 reports saying that Iran is in compliance. If President Trump pulls out of this deal, in simple terms, the 2 scenarios that the deal eliminated, 1, Iran having a pathway to a bomb, and 2, war between the United States and Iran, will once again be resurrected and be put back on the table. The Europeans have made it absolutely clear, in no uncertain terms, that they are opposed to the United States pulling out. The Russians, the Chinese as well. And I think it's important to recognize that if this happens, it is not a conflict between the United States and Iran. It will be a conflict between the United States, Europe, Russia, China, and Iran. The US will completely isolate itself. This is part of the reason in which some of the advisors of Trump have tried to be a little bit more careful, but he seems to have made up his mind, and he has to issue a decision by either mid-October or 30th of October.
And kind of a follow-on question somebody asked regarding that. What can Congress actually do, kind of process-wise?
Well, Congress loves to impose sanctions on Iran. Under all circumstances, where nothing else gets done, rest assured sanctions on Iran tend to pass. The only time that didn't happen was because President Obama threatened to veto sanctions bills because those sanctions would have killed the negotiations. So once Trump decertifies, he essentially gives a green light to Congress to be the adult in the room. And you can imagine how great that's going to work out. So Congress will most likely start imposing new sanctions. Those sanctions will not target Iran directly. This is important to understand because the United States essentially has no trade with Iran. Those sanctions will target third countries that are trading with Iran. So they will target Russia, China, France, the UK, Germany, South Korea, and other countries, who have now, in the last 2 years, slowly but surely, restarted their trade with Iran because that trade is now legal as a result of the deal. So Trump will probably say, well, those are not my sanctions, Congress did this, but that doesn't matter. At the end of the day, there will be a conflict because the Europeans are going to have a very hard time accepting that despite the fact that they were part of this negotiation, the Europeans played a critical role in these negotiations. They paid from the European perspective, they believe they paid the price for the sanctions regime. The US didn't have any trade with Iran. As I mentioned earlier on, because there's no trade, it's not as if any major US companies during these last 5 years lost major deals. There was no deals. So the real trade that was eliminated was Europe's trade with Iran. So they paid a heavy price for it, and for them to see the US withdraw from it is essentially not much different from what happened with the Paris Agreement and other things. So it will be very problematic. It will further increase tensions between the United States and some of its closest allies.
To kind of keep on sanctions for a second, in terms of international banks, how have they reacted to the withdrawal of sanctions? Have they jumped back in? And then the second part of that question was, are the Iranian people feeling relief from those sanctions?
So great questions. Precisely because of the uncertainty as to whether the US will stay within the deal or not, most international banks, despite the fact that it is now legal for them to do so, have still stayed out of Iran. Not because they don't want to, but because they're afraid that they will go into Iran and 6 months later the US will pull out and once again they will be sanctioned. It was very costly for them to leave Iran in the first place, and they don't want to have to go through that process once again. As a result, the Iranian people, frankly, have not experienced much relief. The Iranian economy has picked up. In fact, its growth was projected by IMF to be roughly 6.6 to 7%, which almost any country would kill for. But it's almost exclusively driven by oil sales. So because they've been able to sell their oil, their GDP is growing. Well, oil sales means that all of it is in the hands of the government. The government controls the oil industry. So it's not relieving the general economy in which regular companies, regular traders actually can benefit from having access from the international financial system, but instead it's the government's companies and its state-owned companies that are benefiting currently.
Excuse me. The next question comes from Ayla Kalani, and I apologize if I mispronounce her name. She's on our board of directors, and she was born in Iran and came to the United States at age 21. So her question is kind of interesting in terms of continuity of the government. I'll read it right off the sheet. So she said the Islamic government is nearly 40 years old, with the majority of its founders aging or dying. Rafsanjani, who's basically a moderate cleric, died recently, and there are no other basic succession plans that people know of, or at least the West knows of, in place for whom to take over after the current supreme leader passes away. And my understanding is he is ill. So, in your opinion, what will become of the Iranian government once he passes away?
It's an excellent question. You're quite right. The supreme leader is ill, but he's suffering from prostate cancer, and the flu will kill you faster than the prostate cancer does. So he's been predicted that he will die anytime soon. So far, that hasn't happened. In clergy terms, he's relatively young because he's only 75, 77, and many of these guys live up until shy of 100. So, but nevertheless, there is a vast expectation that he will probably not live for more than 2 to 4 years. So there is much of what you're seeing taking place right now when it comes to the political jockeying in Iran is to prepare various factions on how they will handle the secession. And that secession will be absolutely critical, particularly if there's a new supreme leader that comes in and who will be supreme leader for another 20 years. That person, even though it is not a person that is as powerful, for instance, compared to what a Saddam Hussein or a Gaddafi was within that political system, it is nevertheless the most influential person within that political system. There is a lot of speculation. I'm just going to share some of it. There is a mechanism within the Iranian constitution that says that if they cannot come to terms to a specific person, there can be an interim solution in which instead of having one supreme leader, it will be a council of, I believe, 3 people, the head of the judiciary, the head of the assembly of experts, and the president. It is conceivable that if the conservatives recognize that they're not going to be able to get a conservative to become supreme leader, they may opt to instead have a 3-party system, at least temporarily, because the worst thing they would like to see is to actually see someone like Rouhani or another moderate become supreme leader. So in order to avoid that, they may actually opt for something completely different. But the question is quite right, because that's going to be absolutely essential for the direction that Iran will go. Many accuse, on the conservative side, suspect or accuse Rouhani of wanting to be the next supreme leader. If that were to be the case, it doesn't mean that this Islamic Republic would end necessarily, but it would be a rather different Islamic Republic than an Islamic Republic with Ayatollah Khamenei as its supreme leader.
Next question. Knowing the mullahs in Iran have no mercy for people, do you think making deals with the Iranian government enables them? And basically, let's see, after that they ask, how do you think the Iranian community will help you? Or how do you think the global community can help the Iranian community?
Also great questions. I think there's oftentimes a conception that I personally don't see much evidence for, that believes that the regime in Iran survived because of deals with the outside world, when in reality there was no deal between the United States and Iran up until 2 years ago. And apparently the Iranian regime had survived for 35, 36 years without a deal. So the idea that a deal gives them a lease on life, I've not seen any evidence for. On the contrary, I think that people's reaction inside of Iran shows a very different reality. This is not a popular regime in any shape or form, but this was a very, very popular deal. You had a scenario in which more than 80% of the population favored this deal, and they did so for a very simple reason. A deal would help open up Iran. It would increase trade with the outside world. It would open up the political space internally, which is exactly the route that the population overwhelmingly have chosen to take in order to move Iran into a more open and democratic direction. They've seen what has happened elsewhere. They've seen what happened in Iran in 1979. The slogans in 1979 were quite similar to the slogans that the Egyptians had in 2011 at Tahrir Square. The focus was the Shah must go, and in Egypt it was Mubarak must go. There wasn't a focus on who has to come in his place. And in the Iranian situation, many would argue, and I would agree, they went from a bad situation to a worse situation. Because in revolutions, you have an idea of who you're revolting against. You have a far less clear idea of who you are revolting for. And experiencing that once, and then seeing what has happened in Syria, what has happened in almost every country that had an Arab Spring, the population has clearly chosen that it's better to have a gradual, controlled process as long as there's evidence that it's occasionally moving in the right direction, rather than risking violence, rather than risking something that they could lose control of. Clearly that's going to move much slower, and it's going to be very frustrating. But that is the path that they've chosen. And part of that path was to reduce tensions with the outside world, and particularly with the United States. That's why this deal was so popular in Iran. I mean, people were dancing on the streets when they heard the news that this deal had been struck.
How about Saudi Arabia? How will this deal affect both the U.S.'s relations with Saudi Arabia, and what can be done to improve the relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia?
So part of the calculation behind the deal from the Obama administration side, this is not a central calculation in any way, shape, or form. But the idea was, if this deal can be struck, and if it over time, and when I say over time, I don't mean in the next 6 months, but over the course of 15 years, tensions between the United States and Iran could be further reduced. Areas of collaboration where the common interest existed between the US and Iran could be explored, such as against ISIS, which did happen. It would give the United States greater maneuverability in the region, and it would reduce the United States' dependence on Saudi Arabia. And this was quite important to some people, at least in the Obama administration, including the president himself, who wanted to make sure that the United States could have a bit more of a conditional friendship with Saudi Arabia. Not turn Saudi Arabia into an enemy, but be able to put pressure on Saudi Arabia occasionally when it was spreading too much Wahhabism and creating too much radicalism within the world of Islam that also then spread to the United States and elsewhere. This is also part of the reason why the Saudis opposed the deal. They didn't want to see the United States have this maneuverability to be able to occasionally tilt towards Iran against Saudi. Now we're back in a situation that is actually even more different, more similar than it was before, in the sense that Trump went there, signed $110 billion of weapons sales to the Saudis. It was interesting to see him go there because he said, I'm here not to criticize. And he really made sure that he voiced no criticism against Saudi Arabia. 3 days later, he was in Brussels and he addressed European allies. And boy, did he know how to criticize. So our doubling down on Saudi Arabia has increased in the last couple of months. That actually has heightened tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And ultimately, I think that is not going to be good for the United States. We do need to ensure that there is some sort of a dialogue between the Saudis and the Iranians. Their rivalry, their conflict is now ravaging Syria. It is ravaging Yemen. It is creating more problems. They're competing with each other, not directly, but in other spaces. That's furthering the destabilization of the Middle East. I think we would do the United States' interest a favor by trying to find a solution to that rather than taking sides and intensifying that rivalry.
Next question is on Israel. And the question basically is how much influence do you believe Israel's government has had on the U.S.? And I know you had a few interesting anecdotes in your book that talk about the difference between Netanyahu's perspective as compared to the security establishment's perspective. So maybe if you can address those two different things.
I mean, Israel is a close ally of the United States, and it clearly has influence, and it has a lot of support in many different pockets in the United States, certainly in Congress. On this issue, it was really interesting to see how there were a lot of splits and a lot of divergence. But it wasn't necessarily between the United States and Israel. It was between factions in the United States and factions in Israel. Netanyahu and the political establishment were quite unified in Israel in opposition to the deal. You hardly found any national politician in Israel that would come out and publicly voice support for the deal. Within the Israeli security establishment, however, there was a completely different scenario. 3 heads of the Mossad in a row clearly came out and said Iran does not constitute an existential threat to Israel. They did not say that Iran was not a threat, but they rejected the notion that it was an existential threat. Dagan, in particular, believed that the push for a military confrontation was disastrous. And one of his quotes, he said that if you want a war with Iran, that's absolutely crazy. And he believed it would ultimately be very, very negative for the United States, for Israel. It was fascinating to see that the Atomic Energy Agency in Israel came out in support of the deal. They said that this deal alleviates Israel's immediate concerns with Iran's nuclear program for the next decade. The IDF the Israeli Defense Forces issued its annual threat assessment, its top 5 threats. Iran did not even make the top 5 list as a result of the nuclear deal. The political establishment, however, took a very different position. And again, it goes back to what was said earlier on. It's not necessarily about the nuclear issue itself. It's about the fact that if there is a deal between the United States and Iran, what does that mean when it comes to the future of U.S.-Iran relations? Would it mean a rapprochement between the U.S. and Iran? If there was a rapprochement between the United States and Iran, even if it completely eliminated Iran's nuclear program, what did that mean for Iran's position vis-a-vis Israel? Would the U.S. still back Israel against Iran? These are very valid concerns, but they were not figuring openly in the debate. Instead, the debate narrowly focused on just the nuclear issue.
So I'm going to shift it a little bit for a second into cyber warfare and Stuxnet. So what effect did that virus on Iran's centrifuges have on the whole process?
So a lot of people have asked me about that, and it's very fascinating. Stuxnet was actually started under the Bush administration. When Obama came in, he liked it so much, so he actually intensified it even further. It was a joint Israeli-American sabotage effort, cyber warfare, in which viruses were essentially snuck into the Iranian nuclear program. This one in particular was very sophisticated because it took over the Iranian computers and made sure that the screens said that everything was okay with the centrifuge, whereas in reality, it was instructing the centrifuge to spin out of control. And a relatively large number of Iran's centrifuges actually were destroyed by this. But then the Israelis did a little bit too much of it, and they did it a little bit too fast, frustrating and upsetting the Americans, and the Stuxnet virus spread. And it went to several different countries, and that's how it got revealed. Now, books were written about this, and it's a fascinating story, but precisely because it was new, it was kind of sexy, that there was cyber warfare, in my analysis, it was given a way heavier role than it actually constituted. All of these things were part and parcel of a larger pressure tactic. Sanctions, cyber warfare, the Israelis assassinated several of these Iranian scientists inside of Iran. All of these different things had an effect on Iran's economy, had an effect on the nuclear program, but it actually did not succeed in slowing down the program over even the immediate term. Instead, you saw the opposite. We see the numbers going from 150 to 3,000 to 8,000 to 22,000. In specific moments, it slowed it down, it backed them down, but never in a long-term way that it actually had a devastating effect on the leverage that they had.
The next question comes from Mary Brown. And it basically is a question about applicability towards the situation with North Korea right now. What can we learn, and what can be taken from that situation in terms of de-escalating the current crisis?
It's an excellent question, and I first have to admit I am not an expert on North Korea, so I can't give you a detailed strategy, but I can give you a couple of immediate conclusions. First of all, stop tweeting. Second of all, invest in genuine diplomacy. And when I say that, I'm not trying to oversimplify or make an obvious point. But there is a problem we have, which is when we go to war, we have a commitment. We don't even talk about a plan B. If you raise a plan B in the middle of a war, what do you do if you fail? You're accused of being a defeatist. The commitment we have to diplomacy is nowhere close to the commitment we give when we go into military confrontation. At a minimum, it needs to be the same. Let me give you an example. When diplomatic talks were started in 2009, when Obama first came into office, there was heavy pressure from Israel and from some of its allies in Congress that diplomacy could only be given 3 months to work. If it didn't succeed within 3 months, it needed to be abandoned. And you can imagine, particularly, for the Israelis, they've been handling the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for 60 years, to expect negotiations to fix an issue within 3 months is completely unrealistic. Once the talks failed and ended up giving the president no more political space than 1 year, and most of that actually was eaten up not by the Israelis but by the Iranians themselves because of the 2009 elections and other issues, sanctions were imposed. But no time limit was given to sanctions. There was no even a criteria of when do we know if sanctions are working or not, when do we know if they're successful or not. But no one said, well, we can only try sanctions for 3 years. If anyone tries to have a timetable of how long we're going to be in Afghanistan, immediately people say, well, you don't want to signal and telegraph to the Taliban when you're about to leave, right? But apparently for diplomacy, we think that's a very effective tool, and it's not. If we want to do diplomacy, we have to do it genuinely. We have to really commit. We have to be willing to take the same risk we're willing to take for war, to take it for peace as well. In the case of North Korea, I would assume that because of the way it's been politicized, secret negotiations somewhere where no one knows about it until it's over is going to be necessary as well. The Obama administration used it at least on 2 occasions. The secret negotiations with Iran and Oman, and also what happened with Cuba. I had no idea about that. I woke up one day and found out, and in the midst of all of this, apparently they had to deal with Cuba as well. There was no way the Cuba negotiations would have survived the political circumstances if it had been done in the open. And I would suspect that North Korea is somewhat similar. The third thing I would say is we have to be very, very realistic. We have to have an honest assessment of what is achievable and what is not. And even if we take a negotiating position that obviously is going to be a little bit harder than our bottom line, we need to have a realistic bottom line. And the longer we wait, in the North Korean case, it's very, very clear. Because they're advancing, and every new test they're making is actually putting forward their negotiating position in a way that is actually weakening the US's position. Third or fourth, alliance management was absolutely essential for the Iran negotiations. The United States made sure, and he also got lucky, that its relationship with Russia, China, and Europe on the nuclear issue remained solid, watertight, no daylight in between their positions. because the last thing he wanted was to have the Iranians play the US against the Europeans or the Europeans against the Chinese, Russians. And this was particularly successful, mindful of the fact that this all took place at the same time as the US and Russia had a major crisis over Ukraine. I was actually quite surprised how many of the American officials praised Russia for these negotiations, for the constructive role Russia played, which even took the US side by surprise, mindful of the fact that on other issues, the US and Russia were at each other's throats. That's the opposite of what we're doing right now by threatening South Korea, by canceling our trade deal. If we want to actually be able to have a united international front against North Korea, whatever differences we may have with South Korea over tactics, strategy, they do not belong on Twitter.
Okay, we have time for a couple of audience questions. If you could just raise your hand, I'll come out. You know, there's a few people that didn't get a chance to get their card up.
When Iran made the original gesture to the Swiss to reduce the enriched uranium, what was the benefit to Iran that they were seeking?
Excellent question. First of all, the circumstances in which this happened was just a couple of weeks after Baghdad had fallen with the US invasion. So there was an element there in which the Iranians also felt that things were a little bit shaky for them. But the main thing, and that, incidentally, that proposal, I don't know if I have a copy of it in this book, but I do extensively explain it, and I do have a copy of it in the previous book in the appendix. Essentially what they've been looking for is exactly what I talked about earlier on. They wanted recognition from the United States. They wanted to be able to sit across the table, in their view, as equals, and they wanted to be recognized as a major power in the region, which in reality means that Iran has a seat at the regional decision-making table. That has been the key objective for the Iranians, which essentially is decontainment, to come out of their isolation. Back then, in 2001, they tried to achieve this by collaborating with the United States, with the Bush administration, in defeating the Taliban. When the Bush administration decided to go after the Taliban, they did so. They looked for a local partner on the ground that could do the heavy fighting. And that was the Northern Alliance. The Northern Alliance had been armed and trained by the Iranians for about a decade before the United States started supporting it. And the US and Iran actually very closely collaborated on that issue. Then again, the Iranian objective was to, by showing strategic utility and collaborating, that it would be rewarded by the US recognizing it. So that's been a continuous objective of the Iranians.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Oh, you've read my mind.
With the advancements in fission energy, how will it affect your comments on the future of oil-producing governments?
So I couldn't hear the question entirely. Could you repeat?
There's been great advancements in fission energy, and how will that affect your equations in your comments on the future of oil-producing governments?
If I understood the question correctly, it is an important question because it is putting a tremendous amount of pressure on the oil-producing countries right now. It's actually part of the geopolitical calculus that the Obama administration had. The Obama administration made an audit of the US's global involvement when they first came in. And they drew the conclusion that the United States is overcommitted in the Middle East and undercommitted in Asia. And they wanted to pivot to Asia. Essentially, they believed that the Middle East had started to lose strategic significance for many different reasons. One was the loss of the value of oil in the region, combined with the fact that the United States had a shale oil revolution and explosion, and suddenly the US can now be a swing producer on the oil markets. Combined with the fact that the US has to be focused on who is the likely peer competitor to the US in the next decade or two, meaning who is a country that can actually challenge the United States not on a regional scale, but on a global scale, and challenge the US to sole superpower status. Well, rest assured, that challenger is not going to come out of the Middle East. It's not going to be Iran, it's not going to be the Houthis in Yemen. It's going to be coming out of East Asia. And the more the United States is doubling down on wars in the Middle East, the more its eye is off the ball of the real challenge that is going to come in the next 2 decades. This is part of the reason, again, part of the context, the geopolitical context, that drove the administration towards striking a deal with Iran. If there was one issue that really could drag the United States back into war in the Middle East, it was Iran's nuclear program. Right or wrong, Obama did not go into Syria. We can have a debate as to whether it was right or wrong, but it was driven by him not seeing any solutions and not wanting to get dragged into the region again. He managed to stay out of Syria. Again, right or wrong, we can have a conversation about that. Iran, he felt he could not stay out of militarily unless the issue was resolved. And if he got dragged back into it, his objective of pivoting to Asia and putting more focus on Asia would have been undermined. So that's part of the geopolitical context as to why this deal came about. Thank you.
Just a few things. By the way, I always get to ask the last question sometimes, so here we go. By the way, a few years ago at the National World Affairs Councils in America, I spoke to an individual named Vali Nasser, the president, I believe, at Johns Hopkins, or the dean at Johns Hopkins.
He's the dean of Johns Hopkins.
Yeah, he is. And he spoke at the time in 2014, by the way. It was that conference, so things hadn't quite developed yet in terms of where the eventual agreement was reached. But one of the things I asked him about the nuclear development of nuclear weapons in Iran is that in the modern day and age, nuclear weapons are the key to being a player in the world in terms of power, empire building. We know that Iran, Persia, was one of the ancient empires. Do you believe that Iran will ever fully give up the goal of developing nuclear weapons and give that motivation to be an empire again? Do you think they'll truly give that up, or do you think tactically, on a short-term basis, war has been averted? We're not in the middle of a regional war that could escalate to a world war, and that long-term the dynamics may change, where Persia, Iran changes its mind and decides to become a nuclear power. Just your thoughts on that long-term.
Thank you so much, sir. It's a great question. It is, however, a question in which I'm not sure if I agree with some of the premises. The premise is that the objective was to get a nuclear weapon, and that was given up perhaps temporarily, perhaps permanently. It is a presumption that there is a desire or an objective of empire, and that's been given up temporarily or perhaps permanently. Let me take both of those. The Iranians have had a nuclear program since the late 1960s, convinced by the United States to have a nuclear program. In fact, there were two individuals in the 70s that played a critical role in convincing the Shah to really expand the nuclear program, and of course by American reactors, Westinghouse reactors. You probably heard of them. One is called Dick Cheney, and the other one was Donald Rumsfeld, who served in the Ford administration and had a very strong objective of convincing the Iranians to get a nuclear program. In fact, in 1977, I think, the United States even gave Iran highly enriched uranium. This is before the time in which our policies changed to make sure that we try to prevent highly enriched uranium getting into the hands of any non-nuclear powers. The Shah's objective with this, I think, is pretty much the same objective as this regime currently has. In fact, so many of Iran's current policies are just a continuation of the Shah's policies. They just dust them off, they put a couple of Islamic words on it to make it look as if it's an Islamic policy now, but it's essentially the same. His objective was that he had been convinced by a US ambassador at the time that since Iran was not part of NATO, the United States, in fact, the ambassador made it very clear to the Shah, the United States would never go to war with Russia, Soviet Union, over Iran. It's not a part of NATO, and its alliance with Iran, as important as it was, would not allow, the United States would simply not go to war with the Soviet Union over Iran. So he believed that he needed to have, not a nuclear weapon, but a nuclear weapons option. Having all of the technology, all of the fissile material, etc. So in case the circumstances, the context Iran found itself dramatically changed, he would have a quick path towards a nuclear weapon. But actually building a nuclear weapon itself, he recognized actually would have a strategic negative for Iran, for a very simple reason. If you look at the map, Iran is one of the largest countries in the Middle East. If you combine that with population size as well as resources, it is an absolute giant. If Iran were to actually build a nuclear weapon, there's a significant risk that other countries in the region would also build nuclear weapons. This is one of the reasons why the United States wanted to make sure Iran didn't have this technology in the first place. If then, as an example, tiny Bahrain was not even a 30th of Iran's size, 50th of Iran's population, if they also then built a nuclear weapon as a result of the Iranians building it, Iran would suddenly have lost its conventional superiority and it would be at parity with tiny Bahrain, because both of them now have a doomsday weapon and both of them could destroy each other. An Israeli general put this to me very well. He said, India was 10 times the size of Pakistan until it tested the nuclear weapon. And then the Pakistanis tested a nuclear weapon, and suddenly they were of equal size. That's why, back in 1974, the two most populous and largest countries in the region, Egypt and Iran, jointly started an initiative for a nuclear-free Middle East, nuclear weapons-free Middle East. Why? Because they're the biggest losers if the region goes nuclear. There's also a reason why one of the tiniest states in the Middle East, Israel, does have nuclear weapons, even though we rarely talk about it in the United States, because they don't have a strategic depth. They don't have the same disadvantages strategically as the Iranians would be if they built it. But that's different from having the option. This is precisely the challenge the United States had. The United States did not want the Iranians to have the option, because that, in my view correctly, was sufficiently problematic as the Iranians having the weapon. But part of the reason why it's such a tricky question is because the Iranians rarely at least provided evidence that they were building the weapon. They were just moving closer and closer and closer to what was called a half a screw turn away from having it. So that's one. So the Iranians, at this point, by agreeing to this deal, and as long as this deal survives, it's going to be next to impossible for them to build a weapon. And the reason for that is the inspections regime is so intense. The IAEA is inside of every aspect of the nuclear program, with instruments and cameras, from the very mining of uranium all the way to the processing. As a result, if they were to cheat, the IAEA would be notified very quickly by these modern instruments, and the Iranians would put themselves in a very, very bad situation. If the deal collapses, all bets are off. But if we manage to keep this deal, and those instruments of inspections and verification, by the way, are permanent. Even when the deal expires, the additional protocol is going to continue indefinitely. So as long as we manage to keep the deal, we don't violate it, we don't quit it, I think we are as safe as we can be for them not going in that direction.
Thank you, Dr. Parsi. Very good. Thank you very much. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, we'd like to give you this
Thank
gift.
you so much.
Token of our appreciation for your coming here and sharing
Thank you.
your thoughts and ideas.
Thank you.